Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday, the 25th of July, 2026. It is 9 a.m. and this is your Saturday breakfast show here on Teachers Talk Radio with me, your host, Darren Lester. How are we? I always start the show just by wanting to check in with how the Saturday breakfast community is doing, by knowing how our week has transpired, and just by kind of filling you in on my week before we get down to business. So if you want to let me know how your week is going, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. If you want to, or if you are even listening live, then you can drop me a message either in the YouTube comments or the X comments, and I can read your messages out that way. If you are listening on playback and you still want to let me know how your week is going, because we like building community, even if it's a bit of asynchronous community, then you can also do that over on Blue Sky, where I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MIDLESTER, all one word. So yeah, if you ever want to actually tell me how your week is going when I ask that question, because we always open with that question, then please feel free to, because I do legitimately want to know. I am genuinely interested in what you have to say, in how you are all doing, because one of the things that is coming out of my research at the moment, whoever had 2 minutes and 11 seconds in the pool before I mentioned my doctorate this week, you are the winner, because I can't seem to go a week without it. So I apologize if it's boring to you, or if it sounds braggy. That's the thing that I really worry about when I talk about my EdD, is that it sounds a little bit braggy, and I don't mean it to at all. It's just, as you know, I very much believe in research-based practice. I believe in research-led education, and I believe in teacher researchers. I believe that more of us should be bridging that gap between classroom practitioner and ivory tower researcher. And so I really, I kind of mention it as often as I do, because it is a big part of my life and it's a big part of my practice, but also hopefully to encourage more people to engage in classroom research, even if not at a formal university study level, because I know that not everybody is in a position to be able to afford that. I'm very privileged that I can. Not everybody wants to get a qualification out of it, but there is realistically very little difference between the research that I'm doing and some action research that you might be conducting in your own classroom when it comes to kind of methods and ethics and gathering data and all that good stuff. So yeah, I really do hope that that we can become a community of active educational researchers. All that to say, one of the big things that I'm finding in my research at the moment is the importance of community, the importance of working alongside other teachers, having strong positive relationships with other teachers, and that the huge gains that can then be made in terms of our own careers, in terms of our career trajectories, but also in terms of our well-being, another really important topic that we touch on a lot on in the show. And so, I'm aware that it's not always easy to build those positive relationships in your setting. You might be a person in a department of just you, which I have been in on a couple of occasions. My very first role, I was the only language teacher in that school. So, I had all of the other teachers there, all of the primary classroom teachers, but I was the only one teaching languages. Um, in my current setting, I was a department of one. I was head of myself for a long time. Before my colleague joined me, we needed to expand. We needed more teachers, and so we brought my colleague on board. So I know what it's like to be that department when you're on your own. It might be that you are in a setting where there are lots of personality clashes going on, and so it's hard to build that sense of community. There are all sorts of reasons why you may not feel that sense of community in your brick and mortar school, in your setting. And so I like to think that here on a Saturday morning, we can build our community, we can be together. And if you're not able to get those senses of collegiality in your day to day teaching life, then hopefully you can get it here. And even if you do have it in your day to day teaching life, I hope that you can get it here as well, because you can never have too much collegiality, in my opinion. So, yeah, that was a nice little 6 minute tangent on why I ask you how you're doing. My week has been wild this week. It's my own fault. I tempted fate, didn't I, last Saturday when I talked about how it had been a quiet week, and I appreciated that. Um, it's been wild in a good way. Lots of different opportunities have arisen this week. I've had lots of very strong conversations with people. I'm aware that I'm keeping this all very vague, but that's mostly because that doesn't really have anything to do with what we're doing here. Um, but but yeah, lots of really good things have come out of this week. I've also had one really standout lesson. Um, it's with my N3 Japanese student. I say she's N3 because I've got more faith in her than she has in herself. She's just taken the N4 exam. So in case you don't know, um, there is a Japanese exam called the JLPT, the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, and it is measured in stages from 5 being relatively new to Japanese, maybe studying for a year or two, just getting to grips with the basics, through to N1, which is basically native speaker level. And so my student has just taken the N4 test in this round of testing that was a few weeks ago. I'm absolutely positive that she has done fine. So I now consider her to be my N3 student. She's graduated up, although she wouldn't see it that way. But we've started tackling some really quite challenging material. We're actually reading one of the 4 great novels together. So across China and Japan, there are these uh, 4 great novels, which are considered to be like the pinnacle of Chinese and Japanese literature. They're Chinese to start with, but then when the Chinese entered Japan, they took a lot of their own literacy with them. They introduced their writing system to the Japanese, and so a lot of Japanese literary tradition is rooted in that Chinese entry into the country. And so, yeah, we're reading one of those, and it is a challenging book. It is a very challenging book because they're very philosophical. There is a lot about the religion of the time across all 4 of them. There is a lot about kind of the court comings and goings, the musings. If you're into kind of like courtly high fantasy, then I highly recommend looking up the big 4 of Chinese literature, or the big 4 of Japanese literature, because they are well worth a read. And you can get them in all sorts of translations these days. You don't need to be able to read Imperial Chinese or Japanese to be able to do so. But I am with my student, and it's a big ask. It is a big ask because I'm aware of how difficult, how dense the text is. But she really rose to the challenge. She did really, really well in kind of reading it and asking all the right questions and balancing that kind of linguistic understanding with cultural understanding. And it was just one of those lessons where you realize how important it is to have learners who are engaged and interested. And it really reminded me of how important that actual student wanting to learn, the student wanting to find out more, how important that is for growth and for progression. Because it's one thing to sit in a classroom, and for me to say, I really love these Japanese books, and so we're going to study them together because I think they're great. And, we're quite often judged on how well we are able to get our own enthusiasm for our subject across to our learners. Um, but realistically, enthusiasm is infectious. But if someone's not interested in something, they're not interested in something. I, in school, was not interested in maths. My maths teachers were brilliant. I loved them. They were great, and they were very interested. They were very enthused, but it just wasn't my thing. And that doesn't mean that they were bad teachers. It just means that it wasn't for me. I learned and I tried my best because I understood that kind of education was important and that I needed my maths GCSE to go and do basically anything else. But the subject itself is not my thing, and that is not a fault of my teacher. So I don't always understand why we are judged when we can't make our pupils be as enthusiastic about our subject as we are, but that's a whole other thing. I do feel like um, when we have those students who are enthusiastic, who are engaged, and who want to learn, that's when we can really have the very best lessons because that's when they ask the questions, it's when they lead the discussion, it's when the really deep teaching and learning can happen because it becomes that. And again, we recognize the fact that I was trained um, a socioculturist. I was trained in this idea that knowledge is socially constructed. And so there is a slight bias there. But when you have those lessons that are student led, where they ask the conversation, they ask the questions, they lead the conversation, that is that sociocultural creation of knowledge, that Socratic dialogue, if you like, at its purest form. And again, there are lots of reasons why that is able to happen in this particular lesson. You'll notice that I referenced my student and not my class. She happens to be the only student in this class, so it's one-to-one teaching. She is self-motivated. We have our lesson in an evening because it's when she can fit it in, and she does that because she wants to learn. So it's kind of a perfect storm of learner conditions that allows me to get a little bit geeky about Japanese literature of an evening once a week. But it was one of those lessons where I was like, yeah, this is why I teach. I teach because this stuff is awesome. Somebody else thinks this stuff is awesome. And all of the information that I've learned, everything that I have gathered, everything that I've been able to piece together about this topic is desired by somebody else, that they want that information, and I can be the way that they get it. I can be the way that they are introduced to it. I can be the jumping off point maybe for their own research, for their own further investigation. And just, yeah, it was a really good lesson. And like I said, it was one of those this is why I teach moments, which I think we all need from time to time, just to kind of buoy us back up and to keep us going through the year.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week reports that a former Department for Education advisor and an Academy Trust founder have been given peerages in the House of Lords. Tim Lunig, Director of Economics at Public First and former government advisor, and David Ross, founder of the David Ross Education Trust, were nominated respectively by Lib Dem leader Ed Davey and Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch. Ross founded the trust, DRET, in 2007, and it has 36 primary schools and secondary schools across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Northamptonshire and London. He also chairs the New Schools Network. Lunig served as a chief analyst and policy advisor to the Department for Education between 2012 and 2018, and briefly served as senior policy advisor to the Conservative Education Secretary Gillian Keegan. More details can be found online. The TES magazine reports that Dame Christine Gilbert will lead a review into failings with Key Stage 2 SATs. Results for this year's exams for Key Stage 2 pupils were delayed by more than a week due to technical issues. The review will examine the precise nature of the issues and their origin. It will conclude this autumn. The review will also look at the role that Exam Board Pearson, contracted to run the SATs, had in the process, as well as that of the Standards and Testing Agency, the Department for Education and Ofqual. It will evaluate what changes can be made to improve and avoid further disruption going forward. 2026 is the first year that Pearson has run the Key Stage 2 SATs after winning the bid for the 4-year contract. Dame Christine is an experienced figure in education, is the current chair of Ofsted and is a former Chief Inspector of Schools. More details on TES magazine. Schools Week covers proposals from the Department for Education around the education of pupils who attend provision known as EOTAS, educated other than at school. The article says schools could be ordered to oversee arrangements for EOTAS pupils, and councils could have to provide approved lists of EOTAS providers and make them sign up to national standards. Families have told the DFE in its SEND reform consultation that education other than at school needs specific attention. The article covers 7 key points around possible changes, including considering safeguarding arrangements for online provision, the use of alternative provision for children with health issues, the monitoring of how long pupils access EOTAS provision, and the focus on approved lists for AP. More can be found on Schools Week. Finally, the BBC Health News site reports that children under 16 in England will be banned from buying high caffeine energy drinks from April 2027. Drinks containing more than 150 milligrams of caffeine per litre will be illegal to sell to children in shops, restaurants, cafes, vending machines and online. Lower caffeine soft drinks such as Diet Coke, alongside tea and coffee, are not affected. Drinks including Red Bull, Monster, Relentless and Prime would all breach the limit. The new rules are aimed at reducing obesity and preventing issues such as disrupted sleep, anxiety and lack of concentration, as well as tackling poor school results. The ban is subject to parliamentary approval and will be enforced by local authorities, with businesses who break the law facing fines of up to £2,500. More details can be found on the BBC. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Thank you, Joe. Before we get into today's topic, I'm just going to pick up on the EOTAS topic and what was mentioned about safeguarding for online provisions. Because, of course, I teach in an online school. I mention that every week as well. We really should have a Saturday bingo board, shouldn't we, of things that I mention on a weekly basis. But I just kind of want to make it clear, because I think it's important to be clear, that in my provision, at least in my school, because it is a school, we are an online school, we are all DBS checked, just as we would be for a brick and mortar school. We update our safeguarding training annually, just like in a brick and mortar school. I then actually do additional safeguarding training because a couple of my students have specific needs, which is why they are not in a brick and mortar school, and I make sure that that my own knowledge and my own training is up to date for them, not mandated by my school, but because, as I've talked about before, I don't have that same kind of cognitive overload that I had when I was in a brick and mortar school. I feel more able to do above and beyond additional training. So, you know, I can't claim to speak for all online provisions because I haven't taught for all online provisions, but I can speak for my provision. And I can say that we are just as trained and just as up to date with our safeguarding as any other school. And in fact, I would venture to say we have a slightly better system because everybody is line managed by the same person, which, you know, I'm sure is very difficult for that person, but that person is our DSL. And so we have a very strong working relationship with our DSL. She's pretty much our first point of contact for anything anyway. And so even if we had an issue that was not to do with safeguarding, we would speak to her. And if we have an issue that is to do with safeguarding, we speak to her. So yeah, I would say that actually alternative provisions, education outside of school provisions, we think a lot about safeguarding because we are aware of why many of our children are with us. Not all, like I've said before, quite a few of my students actually come to me in addition to their brick and mortar school, purely because I offer a subject that their school doesn't. And so they kind of attend both. But yeah, we are very much aware of our student profile. And again, I can't speak for all provisions, but certainly where I am, we treat that very seriously. And it is akin to the training that I would get in a regular school. So, you know, just to make that clear, because I think sometimes people can say things like, oh, there needs to be additional checks into X, Y, and Z. And the gut instinct is to go, oh, well, that means that X, Y, and Z doesn't exist. And so I just kind of wanted to, yeah, jump to our defense and say it does exist. Clearly, they are just thinking that they need to check it, to check that it is existing, rather than implement it. All right. Let's then get onto today's topic. So first of all, I need to credit our long-term friend of the show, Tim, who actually came up with the title for this week's show. This is one of the rare shows where it was title first, Usually I write the show and then I come up with the title to go along with it. Usually I try and make the title informative, so that if you are just kind of scrolling through and you see the show, you stop and watch. But Tim actually last week, when I went off on my little mini tangent about SARS and why we use that word, made the Tsarturday breakfast pun, and I didn't have sort of room in the conversation to drop it in, but I liked it so much that I wanted to build a whole show just around that pun. So I got in touch with Tim. I asked whether it, well, actually, no, that's a lie. I told him that this is what I was doing, but he had the opportunity to disagree and to say no. I would have taken that on board, but yeah, from this title sprung this idea of who actually is in charge of education in England specifically, and that's the meat and potatoes of today's show. That's what we are going to talk about today. Let's see, we have got some messages. Tom is saying it's a good title. Thank you very much. I agree. I very much agree. I do think it is really interesting in the online space. And again, I would be interested for teacher researchers, teacher podcast hosts, teacher CPD leaders to sort of weigh in on how they come up with titles, because I am one of those people that likes a catchy title. I like to play around with the words in the title. I like to kind of figure out, but I also understand, and I will never forget my thesis supervisor telling us in a lecture a couple of years ago that when we're writing our thesis, we need to come up with a very straightforward title, because that's what the search engines are going to want. That's what Google is going to look for. I've tried to bridge that with mine, but I'd be interested, like, generally what people think when it comes to titles. Do we go with something that is fun, that is a little bit playful, or do we prefer to go with things that are more, it does what it says on the tin? Because I still haven't come up with a decent answer to that. So I just go with what I feel like on a week-to-week basis, basically. But yeah, I'm kind of coming to this with this question of who is actually in charge of education in England? Because I think most people, if you ask them, and certainly me, if I'm very honest, they would say the education secretary. And you would then be about half right. But over the last 30 years, and then specifically over the last 15, there has been this other figure that has crept into school policy, and that is the Tsar. Not a Romanov. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing, but at least if it were, we would know that the Romanovs were still alive and kicking. Not even, in a lot of cases, a politician, which is really interesting. Sometimes this position is held by a head teacher. Sometimes this position is held by a nightclub manager who turned philosophy teacher. Sometimes it's a position held by a peer of the realm. These people are appointed by a minister. They are answerable to almost nobody, and they are capable of resigning in a bit of a huff on live TV, in a way that no Secretary of State has ever quite pulled off. So kind of today, I want to unpick this idea of the Tsar especially, but the education management in general in England. And we're going to talk about why I specifically say in England a little bit later on. We're going to look at this kind of informal structure of advisors that runs alongside the formal ministry. And we're going to think about what any of this tells us about how government could work better with those of us who are actually in school doing the teaching. So that's kind of the bread and butter of today's show. If you want to get in touch, like I said at the beginning, there are a couple of ways that you can do so. If you are listening live via YouTube or X right now, you can just drop me a comment, and we will have a chat that way. If you are listening on playback, you can leave me a message over on Blue Sky. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER, all one word, and we can chat that way. Just to be clear, and I think it's important to get this clear right now, we're not going to talk about specific individuals, apart from in a couple of cases a bit later on where we look at the specifics of the role of the Tsar. This is not actually an episode about politics or political bias. So this isn't the place to kind of bash the people who are in charge. We are looking purely at why these offices exist, what they do, and what they ought to do. And the reason that I think this is important actually was underlined to me yesterday. I was watching a documentary about something else, and it featured a clip of a full-time TikTok mum. So her job is to be a family influencer. She crops up, she makes short-form content about her children, essentially her family, but mostly her children. And this clip that was shown on this documentary was her going on a rant about schools, and talking about how schools were historically not created for educational reasons, but to indoctrinate children. And, she went off on a whole tirade. And I think that lots of people have the ability to get their point across these days. It's very easy to make social media accounts on just about any platform. It's less easy to get the views on them. It's less easy to get your content out in front of people, but it's very easy to make it. It's very easy to have your voice heard. And while I respect that everybody has a right to an opinion, I also believe that there are facts. I believe that sometimes opinions are misinformed. I like to hope that they are genuinely well-meaning, although that might be a little bit naive. But I think that where there are then opportunities for rebuttal from people who have facts, who have the ability to lay out the actual historicity or whatever it might be for a wider audience, then that is something that we ought to do. And so that's why, rather than going into a kind of pedagogical deep dive as we usually do on a Saturday morning, we're actually just going to lay out some history. We are going to look at the implementation of these ministers of the Tsars, and we're going to think about what that means, because it's not something that is widely talked about, because it's not something that is widely known, but it is something that is very important when it comes to talking about schools and talking about education. And I think that I have a responsibility with this platform that TTR offers me to do that and to address misconceptions and to make sure that the reality of our profession is known, because everybody thinks they know about school because everybody has been to us, or most people have been to a school. But the reality is, even when you're in the profession, you don't get taught very much about the history of the system. You don't get taught very much about why things are as they are. And I do think it's important for us to know that, because if we don't know why structures exist in the first place, we don't have a decent handle on whether or not they should be deconstructed, whether or not they are actually working as they were intended, and whether or not we are complicit in a system that actually isn't working because it has moved away from the reasons that it was implemented in the first place. So over the next, what we've got, 55 minutes, we're going to think about the history of the office that we now call the Education Secretary, because you can't really understand the concept of the Tsar without understanding where that has come from. And this history runs from the Privy Council Committee in 1839. So it's actually a relatively recent development, through to the Board of Education, the Ministry of Education, and then half a dozen departmental rebrandings, through to the Department of Education as it exists today. We're going to look at where this word tsar comes from in terms of the British government, what its legal meaning is, if there is one, and why successive governments have kept using it. Then we're going to have a look at a couple of specific education tsars and look at their stories. So we're going to think about Kevin Collins and Tom Bennett. Then we will move properly into the constitutional weeds and look at what separates a minister from a tsar, because it's not as clear cut as most people like to think, and certainly not as clear cut as I was thinking this time last week. And then finally, we're going to look at, like I said, how ministers can work with teachers to achieve what we all want, which is better education for our young people. Now, this is not a new concept. You know, here on TTR, talking about educational politics is something that we do. And in fact, just yesterday, the Points of View team did a show on whether or not we think the Secretary of Education should be a teacher. So I've popped a QR code up on the screen for those of you who have a visual element today. If you scan that, that will take you to the Points of View episode, where the team discusses that very topic. So give that a scan, hit pause so that you can keep listening to me, and then go back to it later. If you are audio only this morning, or you are listening on playback, then go back through the archives to that show, because it is a really interesting one in terms of thinking about the specific people who take on roles in educational ministry, which, like I said, is not something that we are going to talk about specifically or too much today, because I want to look more in depth at the actual role of the office. So let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is a very good place to start, to misquote Lewis Carroll. Now, the beginning of the Ministry of Education in England is much, much later than we might expect. For most of our history, we have not had anything resembling a Ministry of Education. Schooling before the 19th century was a bit of a patchwork of church schools, charity schools, and private tuition. And there was no central government department taking responsibility for any of it. The first real crack in that arrangement came in 1839, when a committee of the Privy Council was appointed specifically to oversee the distribution of government grants for education. Now, this wasn't a ministry as we mean it in any modern sense. It was a very small group that was made up of existing office holders. So there was the Lord President of the Council, the Secretaries of State, the First Lord of the Treasury, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And none of those people had education as their primary job. From 1857, a vice president was then added specifically to take responsibility for policy. And for me, that suggests that education was being bolted onto the side of another institution rather than built, or rather than having something built for it. So right from the very beginning of our governmental oversight, teachers have not really been involved in this conversation. And I think that is important for us to think about, because when we talk about, as the Points of View team did, should education ministers, I'm going to use all sorts of terms interchangeably today, so please forgive that, but should education ministers, should secretaries of education, whatever we're calling them, should they be teachers? Historically, the answer to that is no. And I think that's probably why these days it doesn't really occur to many people that they should be. We've fallen into this kind of historical cycle where it doesn't really matter because they never have been before, or they rarely have been before. Now, this first arrangement lasted about 60 years. Until the good old Board of Education Act of 1899. I don't know how many other people studied this in depth during their initial teacher training, but we did. We did many lectures on the Board of Education Act, which I actually really appreciate, because I think it has been one of the things that has given me a real grounding in that tradition of education. So this act received royal assent on the 9th of August, 1899. My history teacher will be so proud that I am actually referencing specific dates. And it then came into force on the 1st of April, 1900. And that act abolished that original Privy Council committee and replaced it with a proper Board of Education for England and Wales, which was headed by a president. Now, of course, I'm talking about England and Wales. England and Wales have historically been managed under a joint system, one that oversees both countries. Scotland and Ireland, in terms of the United Kingdom, have always been treated differently. They've always kind of had their own educational systems. So again, that's why when I'm talking about this, I'm speaking about England specifically. That's the context in which I work. It's the context in which I've always taught, and so it's the context that I know. What was crucial about this board is that it absorbed the functions of what had previously been separate in education, science, and art. And so it kind of brought together all sorts of previously disjointed departments. It was given a lot of regulatory power, including the power to establish a national register of teachers. And Paul Gosden, in his 1962 account of the Act that was published in the British Journal of Education Studies, argued that it marks the point at which the central government first accepted this sustained administrative responsibility for schooling across the country, rather than simply supervising grants at an arm's length. So realistically, if we kind of consider that Privy Council to basically be a grant-giving organization, we have only had governmental oversight since April of 1900, so a little bit over a century and a quarter. And even if we add on the Privy Council, that only gives us an extra 60 years. So we've not even reached 200 years yet of the government overseeing education in this country. For the first 2 years of this Board of Education, the presidency was actually combined with the office of the Lord President of the Council. Then from 1902, those two roles were separated out, and the president of the board became effectively a minister who had a single dedicated brief. And all of that information actually comes from the Secretary of State for Education website, which does actually quite nicely outline the history of the role. That kind of plodded along quite nicely until the Education Act 1944, that other big one that we studied at university. And that was huge. This was, in my opinion, and other people may disagree, but in my opinion, the Education Act 1944 is the single most consequential piece of educational legislation that has happened in English history. not least because it created that tripartite system of grammar, secondary modern, and technical schools that then shaped British education for a generation, but is still having repercussions all these years later. For our purposes, though, this morning, the important administrative fact here is that this act converted that Board of Education into the Ministry of Education, which elevated school policy from a board with a president to a fully fledged ministry, to a part of the government. And I feel like this was good for us as teachers, as educators, good for our forebearers, because it was about status. A board might sound impressive, but it is still, in common parlance at least, an advisory or maybe a supervisory body. A ministry is a central instrument of the state. And again, acknowledging my bias of a linguist as a linguist here, words have power. What you call something is incredibly important because it shapes the perception of that thing. So a ministry sounds more impressive than a board. Even if they were regulating in the same way, even if they were doing exactly the same thing, one sounds more impressive than the other. Then 20 years later, so we're looking at 1964, the office changed again, becoming the Department of Education and Science. And that was formed by the merging of the Ministry of Education with the Office of Minister of Science. And it was around this time that Margaret Thatcher actually served as Secretary of State for Education and Science. She was there between 1970 and 1974, so more than a decade before she became the Prime Minister. And I think that is really interesting, regardless of how you feel about her, because she is a very divisive figure. She remains a very divisive figure in UK politics. We have had at least one Prime Minister who has had direct influence over the shaping of schools, even if she wasn't an educator herself. And it's then quite interesting if we kind of consider what happened to and in schools during her prime ministership. What do we call premiership? That's it. To think about whether her previous role actually had any impact, whether it made her think any more closely about schools when she had the opportunity to enact real change. The literary critic Stefan Collini has written about this period in an essay that traces the shift in how British governments thought about universities and expertise specifically. And he dates the Department of Education and Science's responsibility for university funding specifically to this kind of 1964 settlement. And he notes that the department kept this name and this brief until 1995. Now, from this point, the pace of change accelerates. And I think it's worth thinking about that acceleration because it says a lot about how educational policy became more contested and more central to party politics in those last 3 decades of the 20th century. So in 1992, the responsibility for science was hived off to the Cabinet Office and the Department of Trade and Industry. And what remained was renamed simply the Department for Education. And that was a name that suggested responsibility over schools and colleges alone. That lasted for 3 years. In 1995, following the Conservative leadership contest of that year, the Department for Education merged with the Department of Employment to become the Department for Education and Employment, that was universally known as DFEE. And it reflected this policy conviction that the incoming Labour government strengthened, that schooling and the labour market were two sides of the same coin. Now, personally, I take issue with this, and I think that a lot of what we see at the moment where universities especially, but we even feel it in school, a lot of what we are doing is wrapped up in this concept of employability. I feel it when I'm selling my subject at Year 9 options evening. Do GCSE French, because that's going to open you up to more employers. Employers will look favorably on that, even if you only speak a little bit of French, over somebody who doesn't. There is so much that we discuss in education about employability. And I think it does come down to this merger. And I think it's wrong, because I don't think that all education should be for getting a job. I don't think that we should narrow our education in that way. Education should be for broadening horizons. It should be for personal fulfillment, for personal improvement, and being able to get a job as a result of your education should be a side effect of your education, not the reason for it. But that's just my little my little tirade for today.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, so now we're up to 2001. After the 2001 general election, the employment functions were hived off again to create the Department for Work and Pensions, and what remained became the Department for Education and Skills, the DFES, and that name lasted until 2007. Now, 2007 was the year that I qualified, and I think for me personally, a lot of my own muddled understanding of government involvement in education comes from the fact that I trained under the Department for Education and Skills, and then I qualified into a completely different department. And I'm not going to lie, I remember at the time thinking, if they can just constantly remerge, rebrand, split things off, are we important? Or are we just a side effect of things? Because, and again, you know, we recognize the bias in how I have phrased everything. But so far, all of these splits and mergers to me look like something is being taken off and sent elsewhere, and then what is left becomes the Department of Education. It's always like, it always feels to me like we are the thing that is left over while other things merge together. So 2007 brought about one of the more dramatic splits in the department's history. So that was Gordon Brown becoming Prime Minister that summer, and he broke the DFES apart entirely, creating the Department for Children, Schools and Families to handle schools and children's services, and then the separate Department for Innovation, Universities and Skills to take on further and higher education. And I think this is around the point where schools had a lesser focus on education and a bigger focus on the holistic child. This is where schools became children's hubs, as I've referred to them on the show in the past, so that we were kind of taking care of children. We had our wraparound care so that parents could work. We were performing the functions that previously um, other things in the locality would perform, because we were under children's schools and families. Everything kind of became wrapped up together. The rationale for this split at the time was that the old department's remit had become too unwieldy, because it spanned everything from nursery provision to postgraduate research funding, and splitting it in half would let each half focus. I think that that is slightly misguided, because I think it's actually quite good for us to think of formal education as a nursery to postgraduate pathway. We're a bit obsessed with flight paths in education. We have to create roadmaps, don't we, for our subjects to show our pupils what they're going to learn in our subjects from year 7 to year 13. So why do we not see education as equally holistic, as equally spanning? Why do we not recognize that those 4-year-olds that come and sit in our reception classroom and start to learn their phonics are eventually going to be the professors who are leading huge departments in universities? As it was, I suppose it doesn't matter, because the DCSF lasted for only 3 years. When the coalition government took office in May 2010, it dissolved the DCSF and it re-established the Department for Education in its current form, kind of folding children's services back in alongside schools. And this is the name that we've kind of held ever since. That's quite an interesting chronology, because there's been a lot of change. There has been a lot of separation and merging over the last century and a quarter. And even though education could be argued to have always been at its core, like I said, I personally feel like sometimes we are the leftovers, and that we aren't always as well looked after by the government as our department, the existence of our department, might suggest. So let's look at this concept of tsars then. Think about where it's come from and why we have them, and where they fit into this ever-changing departmental landscape that we have. If you've followed British politics at all for the last 25 years, you're going to have heard this word constantly. And in fact, not just British politics, it's existing in a lot of English language political landscapes. There have been drug tsars, there have been homelessness tsars, there have been behavior tsars, there was a catch-up tsar. To me, it sounds a bit jokey. I'm not going to lie. It feels a bit like a piece of tabloid shorthand for somebody who comes in and has an incredibly specific niche role within the government office. But interestingly, the term itself didn't originate in Westminster politics at all. And now I'm not talking about the original meaning of the word Tsar before we borrowed it into English. We're not going to go back to the Romanovs. Although I am reading currently a really interesting Rasputin biography. So we could do, but it's kind of less important for what we're talking about today. According to the House of Commons Public Administration Select Committee's 2010 inquiry into the Tsar appointments, published under the interesting title Goats and Tsars, the word first came into British government usage inside the NHS, where the national directors and national clinical directors were appointed to drive forward specific national service frameworks or major clinical strategies. And from there, it migrated into wider political usage. One of the earliest uses that the committee traced was the appointment of Keith Hellawell as the government's drugs tsar in 1997, alongside a homelessness tsar appointed the following year. What I find really interesting, though, is that at least in my research, there has never been a government document defining exactly what a tsar is. There's nothing that defines what power the role carries or the process that governs the appointment of it. As the select committee put it, the term functions as an informal rather than a formal category within British government, and even senior figures inside the government have struggled to define it with any precision. Giving evidence in the year 2000, Lord Falconer could only point to one individual, the e-commerce envoy Alex Allen, as holding anything close to an official title along these lines. Everyone else was just being called Tsar by the press and by convention. The first Tsar in any actual political rather than clinical sense then was Keith Hellawell, the then Chief Constable of the West Yorkshire Police, appointed in 1998 as an advisor to the Home Secretary on drugs policy. The committee notes explicitly that Tsar and related terms that proliferated around it, so things like advocate, ambassador, champion, are again primarily media-driven terms rather than anything that the government itself originated or controls. And I think that's a really important thing for us to consider when we have this conversation. The government didn't necessarily set out to build this category of SARS. It seems to be that the media needed a punchy shorthand for this kind of outsider, non-ministerial appointment. The label then stuck, and the government, quite astutely, I think, didn't resist it, but they lent into it and they let it stick. I guess because SAR is a bit more decisive, it's a bit more headline friendly than something like expert advisor or non-executive director, which is a little bit formal, a little bit businessy. Then despite of, or maybe because of, this total absence of formal definition, the practice of appointing SARs exploded. There's some research by Ruth Levitt and William Salisbury from King's College London that was published in 2012 that tracked the scale and scope of SAR appointments back to 1997 and found that the annual rate of appointments increased progressively across 4 successive administrations. Their league table of appointing ministers put Gordon Brown at the top. He appointed 46 SARs across his time as both Chancellor and Prime Minister. David Cameron came close behind. And by the time of that 2013 analysis, the coalition government that was then in office had appointed over 100 SARs since they had come into power in May 2010 alone. So in about 3 years, they had made 100 appointments. Levitt and Salisbury pointed out that SARs are drawn overwhelmingly from business at around 40% of appointments, and from the public sector at around 37%, with a much smaller number of them coming from research, legal, or media background. And there is, for anybody who is concerned with a representative government, a persistent gender imbalance in those who are appointed to those roles. So we've got lots of them. We know that their job title is media driven. We know that their job description is a little bit woolly. So what are they actually supposed to do? The Public Administration Select Committee's 2010 report gives us some common threads. SARs are appointed directly by ministers without the need for any standardized or competitive process. The role is usually framed around innovation and delivery, And the idea is that it's supposed to cut through the normal machinery of departments to drive a specific policy priority forward at a very fast pace. That's why they've got these really super niche titles. That's why we can have a behavior SAR, because that job exists to drive forward behavior policy really, really quickly. The Institute for Government's analysis of the wave of SAR appointments during the pandemic captivates this underlying logic really, really well. They were personal ministerial appointments charged with driving progress and bringing coherence to a single high-profile issue of the kind that has, and I quote, long been part of the government landscape, helping to break down barriers between departments and to signal ministerial priorities, end quote. So they kind of act as, or they are supposed to act as intermediaries then between government departments, perhaps between government departments and the people whom they represent. Dido Harding, who led an NHS test and trace, and Kate Bingham, who chaired the vaccine task force, were those kinds of appointments that this term now covers, because they were appointed for an immediate need that had to be met. And you can kind of see why that format is actually attractive to a minister in a hurry. You don't need to create a new statutory body. You don't need any primary legislation. You pick someone with credibility in the relevant field, you give them a title with a bit of shine to it, and you then let them cut across department silos in a way that a career civil servant who is bound by those normal chains of accountability generally can't. And I think the discussion that we have around education secretary, education ministers, and education SARs kind of reflects this. Because I don't know if the appointment of SARs gets the same kind of conversation, are they teachers, have they been in education, what are their credentials, as the appointment of a minister. And I guess it's because we know that a Secretary of Education is a bigger role. It's a more formal role. It's a role that carries more weight. But it is quite interesting to note that without these conversations of where are the SARs coming from, what are their credentials, what are they trying to do, they can move really quickly to push the agenda across. And then the role can be dissolved, and whatever had to happen has happened. And if we're not asking the questions, well, why is this happening? What's going on? What is the outcome? Who are these people? That whole thing can be done very quickly before we realize that it's actually happening. Now, I'm not going conspiracy theorist on you. I'm not suggesting that the role of the SAR has been created to sneak things in under the radar, not at all. But I do think that if we just kind of accept the fact that these are small, fleeting, immediate priority, and then they can disappear roles, we need to accept that we need to be quicker on the uptake of thinking about who these people are, what are they doing, and why are they doing it? How are they actually helping? Because that's the whole point, is to actually help. So in sum, what actually is a SAR? It's not very well defined at all. Why do we have them? To make very rapid change addressing an immediate problem. I think it's a bit of an issue that the role of the SAR is not properly defined, but I do like that we've got this idea that an immediate issue can be spotted and somebody can be appointed to take care of it. Whether or not it's done effectively is a different conversation, which brings us to our education SARs in practice. Now, like I said, this show is not designed to be a political show. I am not sharing which side of the political chasm I am on, although if you've listened to the show at all, you can probably guess. But I'm not going to share that with you because that's not the point. And I'm not here to specifically get at anybody who has been appointed to a role. But I do think it's quite good for us to look at a couple of educational stars and what they have done to kind of show us what the role is giving. So let's start with Sir Kevin Collins, who was appointed in February 2021, so the depths of the pandemic, by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson to the post of Education Recovery Commissioner. Now, Collins was the former chief executive of the Education Endowment Foundation, Education Endowment Foundation. That's called a collocation, by the way, in linguistics, when you have two words that quite often go together, endowment fund, and kind of you just assume that one will follow the other. And his job as Education Recovery Commissioner was to design a long-term plan to help those pupils in England catch up on the learning that they lost during the 2 periods of school closure. Now, I've spoken at length about the fact that I think the amount of lost learning was over-exaggerated, because the school that I worked in at the time pretty much carried on as normal. We just transitioned into an online space. And as you know, I believe that online spaces are just as effective for education as in-person spaces. But again, that's kind of not what this show is about, so I'm going to stop there. He was appointed initially for 9 months, with the option for a further 9 months to follow. And he set to work very, very seriously. He developed a lot of really good proposals that at the time called for something in the region of £15 billion of investment, alongside the proposed flexible extension to the school day that came to around the equivalent of 30 extra minutes daily to give pupils more time for the kind of enrichment activities, the sport, the music, the broader curriculum that had maybe been squeezed out during the pandemic. In June 2021, the government announced the actual funding package for that catch-up, £1.4 billion, an order of magnitude below what Collins had proposed, and there was no commitment to extending the school day. Collins actually resigned within hours of that announcement, and in his resignation letter, he stated plainly that he didn't believe it was credible that a successful recovery could be achieved with the program of support that was given, and he warned that the incremental approach on offer represented what he called a false economy. He had been in post for about 4 months. And I suppose he made the best of the flexibility and the lack of definition that came with being a tsar, because he set out his proposal. We have to believe that in that 4 months, he did all of the research into how much money was needed, what children needed, and he set that out. And then when that was ignored, he said, okay, if you're not going to take on board my advice, I don't really know why I'm here, so bye. And I kind of respect that, not going to lie. Because what is the point in paying somebody to come up with policy, to do the research, if you're just going to turn around and say, nah, we're just going to do what we want? Now, I'm not saying that they should have given in to everything that he asked for. I'm sure there are plenty of economic reasons why the amount of money that he was suggesting wasn't feasible. We know why adding 30 minutes to the school day isn't feasible. There would have been a lot of backlash from children, from parents. Teachers would have need to have been paid more. There's all sorts of stuff going on with that school day extension. So I understand why Boris didn't go for that. But it goes to show, I think, that the lack of definition, that woolliness of the Tsar title, can go both ways. And so if a Tsar doesn't actually get to enact the change that they have been brought on to produce, at least they can leave the post and try and enact that change through industry, through another way, if they have enough drive for it, if it is a topic that they are very passionate about. What happens next is really interesting, because Jeff Barton, the General Secretary of the Association of Schools and College Leaders, said he was saddened but not surprised by this, because he noted that Collins had huge credibility across the teaching profession and across government, and he had expressed hope that this episode would focus ministers' minds on matching their rhetoric about recovery with actual funding. So if anything, the resignation actually was incredibly successful in getting people talking about the role of the Tsar, again, what the Tsar is doing, the respectability of a Tsar across the different domains. You know, we're saying here that Collins was respected by both teachers and government. He could act as that go-between, that intermediary. And then Downing Street came back and they were largely unmoved. There was a spokesperson who said that the Prime Minister was grateful for the work. The government will continue to focus on education recovery. And they committed £3 billion in total by that point. No minister resigned, no policy was reversed, and things kind of plodded on. And so, yeah, respect to Mr. Collins. I think he's a mister. He might be a sir. I'm not sure, so I apologize. But for taking the job seriously and at least trying to do something. If we then look at Tom Bennett, his case shows a different pattern. We don't get a dramatic exit from him. But we get a very long, evolving, and increasingly institutionalized role that stretches across successive governments. So this suggests, by comparing these two men, we're seeing that actually the role of education Tsar is whatever the appointee wants to make of it, I think. So Tom Bennett was a teacher. Before training as a teacher, he had managed nightclubs in Soho. He'd spent a decade teaching Aryan philosophy in East London, and he had built up a bit of a public profile writing about classroom behavior in institutions such as, in publications such as The Times. So, you know, he has a name in education. He founded Research Ed, which was this international network of teacher-led conferences that was focused on making educational research more accessible. He has done independent DFE commissioned reviews of behavior in schools. There are all sorts of things that he has done. But his role kind of doesn't end with all of that interesting stuff. He has continued to act in an advisory capacity around behavior policy, and by 2025, under the Labour government, his role had been formally reconstituted rather than simply renewed. In the summer of 2025, the DFE merged its previously separated behavior hubs and attendance hubs programs into this single integrated scheme, and it appointed Bennett and former head teacher Jane Lowe as national behavior and attendance ambassadors to oversee it. And I think that word ambassador is quite interesting there, because the DFE had by this point stopped using the word Tsar for Bennett and for Rob Tarn, who had a parallel role as the department's attendance advisor. And the government very quietly kind of transitioned through the reconstituting of this role from this concept of Tsar to this concept of ambassador. But the ambassadorial role seems to be just as woolly, just as open as the original role of the Tsar. So we've kind of got what the government seems to have always done with education. Not that Tsars are exclusively for education, of course, but keeping up with what we're doing. We have got this rebranding, this very quiet. We're going to change the name of it, but we're not actually going to make any other changes. It's still going to be undefined. We're still going to let the Tsars kind of do their thing, but we're just going to call it something different. We're now going to go for that word ambassador.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service makes these steps easier, with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions, so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at the role of the ministers, secretaries, and the role of the Tsar, let's really quickly go through the constitutional difference between the two, and then we can talk about all of this in practice. So a Secretary of State holds office within an entirely codified constitutional framework, even if a lot of that framework rests on convention rather than on statute. They are appointed by the monarch on the Prime Minister's advice. They sit in cabinet, and they are by convention a member of the Privy Council, and they're almost always a sitting member of Parliament or a member of the House of Lords, which means that they are physically present in legislature and they can be questioned there directly. The doctrine of individual ministerial responsibility, which is one of the oldest conventions in the British Constitution, holds that a minister is personally answerable to Parliament for the policy and administration of their department, and that is a responsibility that carries with it, in theory, the possibility of resignation if a sufficiently serious failure occurs on their watch. Select committees, which are staffed by MPs from across the political spectrum, have a formal power to summon ministers and senior officials, and the government is expected by convention to respond in writing to select committees' recommendations within a set period. So ministers, secretaries of education have a very codified, formal, defined role, and they are answerable to all kinds of people. A Tsar doesn't have any of that. A Tsar is typically not an MP. They are typically not a member of a political party, and I actually think that's quite important because they are expected to be able to move between different departments, different types of people. They are appointed through a process that appears to be quite arbitrary, which is a criticism that the committee, the House of Commons Public Administration Select Committee in 2010, explicitly notes weakens accountability. They can be called before select committees, like Collins was, but they're under no obligation to face the ordinary run of Parliament questioning that a minister or a secretary might. And because a Tsar's authority flows entirely from the minister who appointed them, rather than from any kind of office that is recognized in statute or convention, their accountability is mediated. Stephen Clear said it is the minister who answers to Parliament for what the Tsar does, it's not the Tsar themselves. And again, like we've explored, this asymmetry can cut in two different directions. On one hand, it's what makes the Tsar model useful when they are faced with an incredibly urgent problem, because you don't need an act of Parliament to appoint someone. The absence of the normal apparatus of departmental process is then a feature, it's not a bug. But that same absence of formal accountability is why the government were allowed to accept Collins's resignation with a polite thank you and goodbye, but didn't feel the need to respond to any of his suggestions. So the Tsar is, a useful intermediary, I suppose, to keep kind of repeating that word. And that's why they can be quite useful to us as teachers. Because particularly if you've got somebody like Tom Bennett, who has a very high profile within the teaching community, who is well respected within the teaching community, acting as a Tsar for something, then you are kind of going to get that buy-in anyway, because we feel like they can be trusted. We know that they come from the trenches. The Minister of Education might not have been a teacher, but at least all of these SARs who are looking to solve problems have been. So they know the repercussions of the problems that they are attempting to solve. So that brings us to the question that is probably most useful for us as teachers, given everything that we've just established about ministers and about SARs. What does a really good relationship between the government and the teaching profession actually look like? Now, if we start with the Work Reduction Task Force, which is in a lot of ways the most direct government profession engagement structure that operates in English education at the moment, we've got 14 members, including representatives from all 4 teaching unions, alongside serving teachers, alongside school leaders, alongside academics. And it is looking specifically at the underlying cause of workload and the efficacy of existing measures to reduce our burden of work. And I love that as a model. I like a task force as a model, because what I like about it is that it is comprised of all of those different types of stakeholders. So you have people from government who understand the intricacies of what funding, for example, looks like. You've got chalk-faced teachers who are the ones on the edge of burnout because of the workload. You've got the academics who are doing the research and are saying, this is what well-being looks like. This is what burnout looks like. This is what the consequence of all of this is going to be. You've got the head teachers who kind of bring that running of a school oversight to the conversation. And I think that this is a more effective way of governments working with teachers than the appointing of a single secretary, minister, SAR, because it gets all sorts of voices, all equally valid and all equally engaged in the conversation, and it lets them be heard, and it comes up with a solution that actually works because it looks at all sides. Now, obviously, this workload reduction task force has only been going since September 2023. So we're about to come into 3 years since its creation. And so it's probably too early to think about whether it is long-term genuinely effective. But it feels to me like something like that. And maybe using this kind of SAR role as the overseer of these task forces. So your SAR is in charge of assembling the task force for this this issue to which they have been appointed to solve. They get the task force together, they oversee the meetings, they're the ones who report to the minister. And you kind of let them bring other people on board. And I think for me, that would be a good way to kind of manage this kind of unofficial role, SAR ambassador, whatever we're calling it these days. Give it some actual weight, give it an actual job description so that we as teachers know what the point is, but without giving them kind of unilateral control over the answers that they come up with, and then making them responsible to whoever they are going to be responsible to, the task force themselves, because they have to answer for the decisions that they make on behalf of the task force, and the task force can turn around and say, no, we didn't say that, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. Answerable to the minister. Essentially, our SAR is going to be our head of department, running our massive department meeting and then reporting back to the deputy head academic. That, I think, if we're going to keep SARs, should be the way that they are utilized. And it's a good way then to get teachers, academics, everybody else in on the conversation. So that's where we are going to leave it for today. I am just going to say that this whole show has been based around the research that I've been able to do just this week. So if anything that I've said has been incorrect, I apologize most profusely. And I am happy to be fact-checked. That's absolutely not a problem. But all of this has just come from my research, from all of the sources that I have read, and of course is buoyed by my own opinion. So we've got to keep that in mind as well. But as always, thank you for listening. I hope you have found this interesting. Not the usual pedagogical deep dive that we usually go into, but I think important nonetheless, because we need to know who these people are that are responsible for us, that are responsible for our working conditions. And we need to think about whether they are effective in the job that they are doing. And if not, what could they be doing to become more effective? I hope you have a great rest of the weekend. I hope that you have a wonderful week. We will be back for breakfast together next Saturday. So I hope to see you then. Until then, though, thank you very much and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.